Hey everyone, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Icarus, and today, despite my cheery demeanor, we are actually going over what I've discovered is the biggest bullshit so far in Whipping Girl. Today we're actually going to try and go through two chapters because chapter 3 is very short and I don't have a lot of commentary on it. And chapter 4 is something else. So, chapter 3. We'll start again with my notes, then we'll go back to the beginning and we'll go through the whole thing. So, we're going to have my usual disclaimer as well, where we are reading a book that was written in 2005, published in 2007. So, some of the vernacular is outdated in today's context, as well as this is written by a single trans woman, and while she has made some contributions, I'm reading this from a trans masculine perspective, and that's where it starts falling woefully short. Also, at the end of this, I'll show you Ned because I mentioned yesterday she was getting a haircut. Haircut is basically done. Without further ado, notes from chapter 3. I wrote, I find myself mostly chafing in this chapter when she just assumes that everyone experiences the world the same way she does. And I think that's how most of this book reads. The idea of non-binary identities being a middle road to your true sex because she went from non-binary to binary trans, etc. There is a morbid fascination with transition, but I think it has a lot in common with fascination about unusual body modifications, from flattening an infant's head to full body tattoos and piercings to those people who gradually stretch their neck with rings. And I looked into the stretching the neck with rings. It's apparently more of a visual thing, typically common in some Asian and African cultures, but I remember when I was a kid, I used to see pictures of these different African tribes where the women would, and some men, would actually stack gold or gold plated rings and make their necks look longer because it was a sign of attractiveness. So that's where I was getting with that. But apparently, further research says that it also happens in some Asian cultures, and it's more appearance, not actually body modification, like I had thought when I was a kid. So this is chapter 3. It's called Before and After, Class and Body Transformations. And it is a lot about how popular media and news and all that stuff seems to be obsessed with the physical transition of trans people, which I do agree with. There is an obsession over the transformation that a transgender person can go through, either through hormone therapy or surgery or both. And that makes trans women the more interesting to look at, all the more the spectacle, because trans women can have the biggest physical transformations. If you think about it, estrogen is a hell of a drug. You end up developing breasts, your body tissues sort of change around, so you start having a little bit more curves. A lot of trans women look into vocal training because if they are post puberty, your voice has dropped. There's not really a way to undo the changes to your vocal cords, so vocal training helps them develop more of a feminine voice, though I personally chafe at the idea of having to change your language to what a woman might say, how they might speak. I do recognize that is a thing, but that's neither here nor there. And that sort of thing. So they are far more interesting to watch transform versus trans men when it's seen as more normal for women to want to look like men. And there's a whole issue behind that as well. We're not going to get into it right now. I want to go over what I've highlighted. So she's talking about documentaries and TV programs, talking about how they sort of reveal the compulsions of cisgender people. She calls them cissexual, remember that, just in case it comes up in a quote. But I'm using the terminology that's recognized today. But she's talking about that, and she's talking about how TV shows do sort of glorify this physical transformation, and talking about how very common TV shows were at the time, from like Extreme Makeover, The Swan, I Want a Famous Face, plastic surgery before and after, all of those sort of things. And this was also around the time of the Biggest Loser and that sort of thing for American audiences, where you are watching these people have these very drastic changes. So I want to read a quote that I highlighted. It's a pretty long one, so I apologize. So why do plastic surgeons So why do plastic surgeries, gastric bypasses, and sex reassignment procedures receive such similar treatment in these programs? It is not simply because they all portray cutting edge medical procedures. After all, there are plenty of shows that feature various medical techniques and surgeries, but they are generally far more serious and less sensationalistic in tone. Nor can it be said that the rarity of these procedures leads to the public's fascination with them. While sex reassignment is still fairly rare, 9.2 million cosmetic plastic surgery procedures and an estimated 140,000 gastric bypass surgeries were performed in 2004. It also can't simply be that these shows depict transformations of some kind. After all, one occasionally sees behind the scenes programs about Hollywood makeup artists and costume designers who can drastically change an actor's appearance, yet they are never given the sensationalistic spin that these other types of transformations receive. There are also plenty of programs that feature non surgical makeovers, for example, Queer Eye for the Straight Guy and What Not to Wear, but they tend to have a more laid back and informative feel, seducing the audience with their you can do this yourself attitude, in contrast to plastic surgery and sex reassignment shows, which have a far more cold and voyeuristic feel to them. And while a woman who changes her hair color and style, or a man who shaves off his beard, undergoes a significant transformation, one that leaves them looking like a completely different person, the audience is not encouraged to gawk over their before and after pictures in the same way they do with the subjects of plastic surgery and sex reassignment programs. I would argue that the major reason that plastic surgeries, gastric bypasses, and sex reassignments are all given similar sensationalistic treatments is because the subjects cross what is normally considered an impenetrable class boundary, from unattractive to beautiful, from fat to thin, and in the case of transsexuals, from male to female or from female to male. Rereading this, I noticed that she has a tendency, and this is just a general thing, to reuse the same language over and over. The sensationalist. See, I can't even say it. So I noticed this a little bit more when I'm reading it out loud versus reading it to myself. She uses the same terms over and over, and some of them feel a little bit more mouthful than other words, and she's not necessarily doing it in a way that I find really annoying in like artist critiques or art theories, because I get so mad when when people make information intentionally harder to obtain. Like they take an Ouroboros knot and then they add the fourth dimension into it, and you have to sit there and think about every single word and create a plot map to figure out what they're trying to say. That is stupid as hell. She's not doing that. This is way more laid back. It is mostly about her experiences. But she does tend to give the same sort of sensational sounding language, and then she repeats it, and that can sort of become a meme where it's being repeated in your mind, and people use this like mnemonic devices to memorize stuff, and by repeating it over and over it gets in your head. And I'm wondering if that sort of thing happens, and why it's so hard for people to let go of her work and recognize it as a product of its time and fairly imperfect. So, getting away from that, what about what I've actually read? She's talking about all of those huge, huge surgeries and stuff that people do. And I do agree in some part that there is something about the idea of class boundaries, especially like the unattractive to the attractive, especially when it comes to male to female, having a man in a dress to a conventionally attractive woman. That there's some voyeuristic tendency for people to want to see that and want to consume and see those differences in 20 minutes or less. Like, you don't want to be there for all the grunt work. You just want the before and the after and enjoy that someone could do that. However, I do argue against the idea that I grew up watching What Not to Wear. There's still a voyeuristic tendency to that show. I haven't seen Queer Eye for the Straight Guy. I'm going to admit that. I've never watched it. I don't really have interest in watching shows that cause dress transformations, because I grew up on What Not to Wear. I'm biased against it because you're watching that, you're seeing the before pictures, and they're always very unflattering. They don't know how to dress themselves to look good. And it's not a you can do this yourself, because they're given money to go buy a whole new wardrobe. And that's just not very feasible, even in 2005, 2007. And I need to remind y'all, I was 14 in 2007, so I was taking in these TV shows without any critical thought, and I thought this was just the thing to do, and I was very self conscious about myself. As for like the 600 pounds to whatever, the people getting really, really thin, there's an element of the grotesque to it, because the human body isn't meant to change that quickly in the short amount of time that we're given to get to know these people. So if you have like a TLC special that is talking about someone who is overweight, who is not conventionally attractive, who is upset with their body and they want to change, you're watching like 45 minutes, 15 minutes or so of commercials, and you're watching them go through months or possibly years, depending on how they go about it, of the gastric bypass, losing weight. Then they have to get surgery to get rid of the flabby skin. And then they may decide, while they're going under the knife, go ahead and fix some of the other stuff they're insecure about. There's also the fact that a lot of these things, despite her talking about how common they are, they're still taboo. You don't talk about the plastic surgery. You see people making fun of celebrities who opt to get Botox or lip fillers, or they chose to fix their nose because they weren't happy with it. Cis people aren't allowed to change their bodies, just like they don't want trans people to change their bodies. I think there's an element of jealousy, actually, if a cis person sees a transgender person opting for a surgery to make them feel better about themselves, because the cis person, especially if you're looking at middle class or lower, plastic surgery is not something that they can obtain easily. So they don't understand why someone in their same class level and their same social status will put themselves through all of this, will go into debt, will jump through all the health insurance hoops to try and make it more affordable, because they have a nose they're not happy with. They feel fat and ugly and they're not happy with their bodies. But not only are they not allowed societally, but it's something that's not within reach because plastic surgery is elective. And I came to that conclusion mostly from seeing how people talk about plastic surgery and seeing how people talk about transgender bodies and transgender surgeries, as well as reading science fiction and seeing how common it is for people to be able to change how they appear. Anything from the three boobs lady in one movie that got remade that I can't bother remembering. It had like Arnold Schwarzenegger in it, I think, to full body modification, inserting random pieces of bone or stuff to make yourself have horns, that sort of thing. These are things that are possible today, but people don't do them because it gets them ostracized. So I think there's a lot more to it than the idea of bypassing class boundaries. I think there is jealousy and the desire to see something grotesque, because the body is not meant to change that fast. It is inhuman, and we don't really stop and think, oh, well, it took them months to get to this, to take off the bandages, to go through any therapy that they need to present us this classically beautiful person. And other shows like What Not to Wear and that sort of thing, when they revisited people, they would still try and have those sort of thoughts about changing their appearance and wear what's flattering, but you would notice that there's just as many people that backslid. So those are my thoughts on it as someone who grew up on these types of shows. All right, now we are getting to another quote talking specifically about male to female transition and touching upon trans men. So, perhaps for this reason, the most commonly depicted subject on these programs is trans women who start out as a seemingly masculine male. In addition to the reasons for media's focus on trans women rather than trans men, which I discussed in Chapter 2, which we dismantled in Chapter 2, there are additional physical reasons to account for this phenomenon. Trans women often have more difficulties passing as their identified sex than trans men do, not only because of limitations of the MTF transition process in reversing some of the irreparable effects of prolonged exposure to testosterone, but because people in our culture predominantly rely on male rather than female cues when determining the sex of other people. And I just wrote, Serrano's making vast assumptions about trans male experiences here, because that is true. I do not deny that pre-HRT, pre-op trans women have a difficult time passing, especially if they start transitioning when they're older and they have more traditionally masculine appearing builds. However, this is completely ignoring the trans male experience because trans men can just have just as much difficulty passing as well. And then part of this is because of the deconstruction of women's clothing, where it's more socially acceptable for a woman to dress as a man in some contexts. Overall, it's more acceptable for a woman to dress as a man than it is for a man to dress as a woman. It's plain and simple. So it also makes seeing a transgender man who is dressing as a man to be called out as a woman. It's just the reality of the situation. It's not a simple matter of every trans man is conventionally thin and has a small chest, so it's easier for them to bind, that sort of thing. You end up with a lot of trans masculine people who have to deal with the insane effects that estrogen can have on the body. Because let's face it, as typically women have wider hips than men. There's this whole thing about needing the hips to be wider to bear a child. That's just an anatomical thing that we can't really change. And that makes it harder to shop for clothes because the pants don't fit right. And if you wear women's jeans, that ends up hitting all the curves that you don't want to be shown. So, I feel like once again she is belittling trans men to make the trans female experience. Plus here you actually see some of the demonization of testosterone that we see so predominantly today. There is another paragraph about how trans women often require more procedures, which, fair. There's a whole lot of stuff, like anything from bottom surgery to breast implants to having the Adam's apple shaved, having contours done. And this is completely ignoring the fact that there's a lot of these surgeries in the opposite direction for trans men, as well as how limited phalloplasties and I forget the other one, where it basically still includes the clit and it's not as dick-like as a phalloplasty. But I know a lot of trans men who are anxious about bottom surgery because it doesn't show the results that they really want to have. Whereas bottom surgery for trans women, you can't really tell the difference between it and a cisgender vagina. And I just highlight the fact that she put voice lessons to overcome their deep voices as a less common procedure. That's definitely changed in the 15 odd years that this was written in. Then there's these programs concentration on trans people who undergo multiple medical procedures or who take lessons to help them pass as their identified sex tends to make invisible the many trans men and women who pass rather easily after hormone replacement therapy alone, or who choose not to undergo all the procedures commonly associated with transsexuality. And I just wrote, for someone who seriously derided the idea of transgender and non-binary identities, this seems sus. Because it once again feels like she's throwing other people under the bus in order to make trans women's struggles the only ones that matter. Then we get back to my whole thing about how, yeah, I can see where she's coming from. I disagree with a lot. I really want to get to the next chapter. because this one pissed me off to the point where when I scrolled down past my little two links I'm going to give you guys, I wrote, I hate this. I hate you. I hate everything about this chapter. Fuck you, Serrano. Gender essentialism bullshit. This chapter had me literally disassociate from my body while I was reading it, and I was only a couple pages in because I got so mad at the entire thing. So this is chapter 4, Boygasms and Girlgasms, a frank discussion about hormones and gender differences. This chapter, she is talking about hormone replacement therapy, and she admits that this is mostly about the psychological changes and how they affected her. She also mentions she talked to a handful of trans women as well as read a couple of books about trans men. She, I believe, also mentions talking to a few trans men, but she never really goes into it, and she kind of makes this chapter once again something that is supposed to be spread across the board, but it's very about her. And since she comes up with anecdotal evidence, I'm going to provide my own experiences as well. So anyone who wants to know more about my transition experience, here you go. So we're going to start with sex hormones have become horribly politicized in our culture, evident in the way that people blatantly blame testosterone for nearly all instances of male aggression and violence, or the way that women who become legitimately angry or upset often have their opinions dismissed as mere symptoms of their body chemistry. Alright, I'm legitimately shocked she chose to highlight this. I'm assuming it has less to do with trans men transitioning, though. Of course, and this is jumping down a little bit past pseudoscientific studies, of course, such overt politicization has created a significant backlash of people who now play down the role of hormones in human behavior, who argue that most of their presumed effects, making men overly aggressive and women overly emotional, are better explained by socialization. After all, young boys are encouraged to be aggressive and discouraged from showing emotions, and vice versa for girls. And I write, this is pretty damn true, to be honest. A lot of it has to do with how you're raised as well as your brain chemistry. Hormones can have an effect on how quick you snap from one thing to another, but the way you're taught to deal with your emotions and gut reactions are far more important and more telling in how you will behave. So here I am saying testosterone and estrogen, progesterone, anti-androgens, all of that stuff, they can have a limited effect on how you experience things. And I see this mostly in libido, which we'll get into. But jumping in the next sentence, having experienced both female and male hormones firsthand, I feel it's my duty to spoil this nature versus nurture debate by offering the following description and interpretation of my personal experiences transitioning from testosterone to estrogen and progesterone. I wrote, I don't look forward to this, because I don't. Oh, I skip a thing that talks about on-off switches to the second issue to keep in mind is the difficulty in distinguishing real hormone effects from their perceived or presumed effects. For example, shortly after I began hormone therapy, I had a strong craving for eggs. I immediately attributed this to the hormones until other trans women told me they have never had similar cravings. I write, and yet I suspect if you do include any other experiences of transition into this, you're not going to have a very varied pool. All this build-up is making me anxious. This is where I just start writing my thoughts as they come out. Skipping a little bit down past more eggs talk. For these reasons, I will limit my discussion here to those hormonal changes I have experienced that have been corroborated by other trans women I have spoken with. AKA, be prepared to get some biased responses about things regarding tea. That's for me. There's another thing about my anxiety growing, and then people often say that female hormones make women more emotional than men, but in my view, such claims are an oversimplification. How would I describe the changes I went through then? In retrospect, when testosterone was the predominant sex hormone in my body, it was as though a thick curtain were draped over my emotions. It deadened their intensity, made all of my feelings pale and vague as if they were ghosts that would haunt me. But on estrogen, I find that I have all the same emotions that I did back then, only now they come in crystal clear. In other words, it is not the actual emotions, but rather their intensity that has changed. The highs are way higher and the lows are way lower. Another way of saying it is that I feel my emotions more now. They are in the foreground rather than the background of my mind. And I write, this singular example that sort of continues with the trend of trans women getting more weepy on E. Meanwhile, I am just over here just as emotional as I was when I was off T. Admittedly, crying at the start was a little harder when I first started testosterone, but in every other sense of the term, no curtain has dropped on my emotions. In fact, I am literally bipolar. I take medication to have my mood stabilized. And now it's actually fairly easy for me to cry, and I find it most easy at night after I've taken my sleeping medication when my brain is chemically told it's time to shut down. I'm way more weepy than I ever was when estrogen was the predominant sex hormone in my body. That's such a dumb way to say it. I'm sorry. I'm mad, and so I'm snapping at her writing choices now. Moving on down, the change in the intensity of my emotions is paralleled in my sense of touch as well. I cannot say for sure that my sense of touch has improved, that I'm able to feel things that I couldn't before, but it surely plays a greater role in how I experience the world. Whenever I'm interested in something, whether it's a book, a piece of artwork, an article of clothing, or an object or material of any kind, I feel compelled to touch it, to handle it, as though my understanding of it would be incomplete without the tactile knowledge of how it physically feels to me. In contrast, when hormonally male, I generally felt satisfied with simply seeing an object of interest. This is where I started to dissociate, because it's genuinely what the fuck. I am on testosterone. I have pica. I put things in my mouth. I need to touch things. And Briar is also recently starting on testosterone. They've always been very preoccupied with needing to touch things, having very tactile shit. That has not changed since they started T. And in fact, I often have to touch something first and discourage them from touching it because they also have tactile issues. They will touch slime even though they know they don't like the feeling of slime. They will touch velvet even though they know they don't like the feeling of velvet. So this is when I had to pause, and it's just like, I literally can't feel my arms or legs because I am leaving my body. I am transcending this chapter. There's also a note of, my sense of smell has definitely increased in sensitivity. Well, guess what? When I was 10, 11, 12, my sense of smell disappeared. Now that I'm 28, I'm starting to smell things again. I can smell Briar's cooking. I could not smell Briar's cooking a year ago. I'm on testosterone. I've been on testosterone the entire time I've been with Briar. My sense of smell is improving, and estrogen isn't the dominant hormone in my body anymore. Now we'll get to the fun one. Without a doubt, the most profound change that has come with my hormonal transition has been in my sexuality. In fact, the very first change that I noticed, which came during my first few weeks on estrogen/anti-androgens, was a sharp decrease in my sex drive. I noticed this for the first time at the end of a really busy week. After working many hours and being out late most nights, it suddenly occurred to me, only after the fact, that I had neither had sex nor masturbated during the entire week. While this may not seem impressive to some readers, for me, at the time, it was completely unheard of. I could barely go a day, let alone 2 days, without some form of release. In fact, for much of my adult male life, masturbating was an activity I typically indulged in 1 to 3 times a day. While my sex drive may have decreased, this surely does not mean that I have lost interest in sex entirely. I still intensely enjoy masturbation and sex. It's just that I crave it about 3 to 4 times a week rather than 1 to 3 times a week. I'm going to read my notes first, and see if I have anything to add. I knew this was going to come up from the moment I read the chapter title. From what I've been able to find researching, estrogen does not actually decrease one's libido, and in fact, when menopause hits, the immediate dip in estrogen and progesterone actually kills one's sex drive, while the testosterone levels slowly dip. So basically what I'm saying there is estrogen and progesterone, when you enter menopause, those levels drop, like real hard in comparison to everything else. Your testosterone levels, however, just steadily decrease down over time. So you're looking at a roller coaster versus a hill. A very shallow hill at that. I think one's TVE balance is more about if you're a light switch or a dimmer switch. One is instant, the other not so much. And I can provide evidence as well as she can. I started exploring masturbating a year before I started testosterone. I lived alone. I had learned so much about sex that I wanted to see if I could get into it. While my libido was basically zero, or so I thought, when I masturbated, I found that I would get turned on over time. And then I slowly felt the urge to masturbate outside of when I was preparing to masturbate. When I started testosterone, it's like the dimmer switch became a light switch, and I was a lot more aggressive about trying to find the time to masturbate. So, what I'm saying there, and this is just like she's talking about herself, I'm talking about myself. Your libido ultimately is very individual, and how you relate to it and how you process it is different. But when I was pre transition, I was very scared of sex. And then I started making dildos. Then I started researching because I thought it was funny that being the asexual person who made dildos and knew a lot about sex could give advice to people who were just getting into it, who were allosexual, that sort of thing. And then, because of all the research, I decided I wanted to masturbate. I wanted to see if I could have an orgasm, that sort of thing. And I don't know if it's just because of how I was raised in such an anti sex purity culture or what, but as I learned to masturbate, I started finding myself interested in masturbating, not just in the moment, not just sitting down. Okay, I am going to read porn and masturbate to it because I want to experience this too. Me at work thinking, I would like to masturbate when I get home. It would be nice. A good unwinding experience. And admittedly, during that time, I didn't have the tools necessary to have an enjoyable experience, and I didn't have the knowledge. After I started testosterone, my libido jumped up. Like, not immediately, but I started noticing that I was thinking about it more, and I wanted to do it more. And I would get frustrated if I could not make myself feel good in a timely manner. I found because I lived alone, I could spend an entire day off of work going off and on reading different fan fiction stories or original work, watching porn, playing horny games that were free, and I discovered a lot about my kinks and fetishes during this time. I immediately disagree with her. I'm so angry that this is here. I feel like there is an essential misunderstanding in how one's horny meter, libido, sex drive, and sexual attraction works, and a lot of this is still tipping over both into trans narratives as well as asexual ones. I'm going to skip to the end of the next paragraph because she's still talking about it. And she mentions, even before I lost the ability to maintain erections, I found that what used to excite me, that back and forth stroking action that males typically prefer, really wasn't doing the trick anymore. And once again, that's something that's not very universally true. This is more of a men are expected to enjoy this, so that's typically what they're given. And she also mentions how exploring with vibrators was new, but when she was pre-E, it was too intense. A lot of this has to do with what you're exposed to, what you choose to experiment with. I genuinely believe that even pre-E, she probably would have enjoyed some of the more unconventional sexual activities. Like maybe if you don't hold the vibrator to the head of your dick, but you hold it to your taint, you're stimulating your prostate. And I'm not going to get into that. Sorry, that's not this sort of episode. But she is once again conflating her experiences to universal experiences, not just for cisgender or gender nonconforming men, but also for trans women and also for trans men, and in some cases, cis women, because she's talking about hormones that are in everybody's bodies. Then she talks about how she is less visual with regard to her sexuality, and once again, she's sort of conflating this idea that people, women, or people with high estrogen in their bodies tend to be less visual in consuming porn, which once again is just not universally true. These are more stereotypes. Can you think of how much good free porn there is that doesn't treat women like a fucking fleshlight? I sure can't. And I have a feeling women don't want to look at porn where they're a fucking fleshlight. She writes, upon hearing my experience, I am sure that some people, particularly those who favor social rather than biological explanations of gender difference, will be somewhat disappointed at the predictable nature of my transformation. I write, no, I'm infuriated you seem to think this is fairly universal. Trans men typically give reciprocal accounts. They almost universally describe an increase in their sex drives, which become more responsive to visual inputs, male type orgasms more centralized, quicker to achieve, a decrease in their sense of smell, and more difficulty crying and discerning their emotions. And there's an annotation, but we're not going to get into it. It's one of the books she read. And then she mentions, on the other hand, those who are eager to have more popular presumptions about hormones confirmed will probably be just as disappointed to hear what has not noticeably changed during my hormonal transition. And she talks about all sorts of things, including my sexual orientation, which I just write. It's actually still fairly common for you to question your sexual orientation when you start transitioning. I argue it's less of a hormone thing and more of a, because you've started transitioning, you feel like you can explore more. It may not be conscious, but you've started such a big change in your life. What's going to stop you from continuing? And she mentions, while my sexuality was definitely more visual when I was hormonally male, and I certainly enjoyed looking at porn on occasion, I still always preferred erotic stories and fantasies to pictures of naked bodies. So it's not even the fact that she changed the moment that when she started taking E, but she's always preferred that sort of medium over visual porn, which, can you see why I'm angry? And then she's talking about how she's just da da da. Some trans men have also described becoming more aggressive or competitive since taking testosterone, though many others describe themselves as becoming more calm. And then she starts comparing herself to trans men. Then I go on to, thus it is clear that typical male levels of testosterone in and of itself are insufficient to produce many of these stereotypically male behaviors, most likely because of their variability that exists from person to person in the way this hormone is processed and experienced. While a part of me is tempted to attribute my apparent imperviousness to testosterone to the fact that I am trans, that on some level I was never fully or completely male, I also realize that many cissexual people are exceptions in this regard as well. I know plenty of non-trans men who are not particularly into porn, who are not very aggressive, and or who often cry. I have also met women who have high sex drives, who enjoy porn, and who are just as aggressive and competitive as the average alpha male. Hate that term. Thus, there seems to be more variation among women and among men than there is between the averages of these two groups. Acknowledging this variation is absolutely crucial in order for us to finally move beyond the overly simplistic and binary biology versus socialization debates regarding gender. After all, there are real biological differences between hormones. Testosterone will probably make any given person cry less frequently and have a higher sex drive than estrogen will. I hate everything about this take. I wrote that. I hate everything about this take. I hate this chapter to the point I want it to yeet my computer to the ground, but I will not because it was expensive. And we don't have the money to do that. While many gender theorists have focused their efforts on attempting to demonstrate that this sort of socialization produces gender differences, it seems to me more accurate to say that in many cases, socialization acts to exaggerate biological gender differences that already exist. I wrote she's trying to have it both ways. I almost can see where she's coming from, but the way that she's saying everything is so biologically gender essentialist that I cannot take anything she's saying seriously. I would have to step back and look at this work from someone else because everything preceding this statement pisses me off to the point I don't want to read her stuff anymore. And then I have a very long quote. Recognizing the distinction between biological and essential gender differences has enormous ramifications for the future of gender activism. Since there is a natural variation in our drives and the way we experience the world, attempts to minimize gender differences, i.e., insisting that people strive to be unisex or androgynous, are rather pointless. We should instead learn to embrace all forms of gender diversity, whether typical, feminine women and masculine men, or exceptional, masculine women and feminine men. Notice the binary that's still here. She's not recognizing non-binary identities. Further, since some attributes that are considered feminine, e.g., being more in tune with one's emotions, or masculine, e.g., being preoccupied with sex, are clearly affected by our hormones, attempts by some gender theorists to frame femininity and masculinity as being entirely artificial or performative seem misplaced. Rather than focus on how femininity and masculinity are produced, an issue that has unfortunately dominated the field of gender studies as late, we should instead turn our attention to the ways these gender traits are interpreted. The issue of interpretation becomes obvious when considering transsexuals. For example, one cannot help but notice how much more empowering trans male descriptions of hormonal transition tend to sound compared to those of trans women. Trans men experience an increase in their sex drive, become less emotional, and their bodies become harder and stronger. All of these changes having positive connotations in our society. In contrast, I have experienced a decrease in my sex drive and become more emotional, softer, and weaker, all traits that are viewed negatively. The reason for these differing connotations is obvious. In our culture, femininity and femaleness are not appreciated nor valued to the extent that masculinity and maleness are. And while embracing my own femaleness and femininity during my transition was personally empowering and rewarding, I nevertheless felt overwhelmed by all the negative connotations and inferior meanings that other people began to project onto me. These meanings were not only projected onto my female body, but onto the hormones themselves. From the warning label on my progesterone prescription that read, may cause drowsiness or dizziness, and avoid operating heavy machinery, to the men who have hinted that my female hormones were responsible for the fact that I disagreed with their opinion, and women who sneered, "Why would you ever want to do that?" upon finding out that I have chosen to cycle my hormones. The reason that stuff is on your progesterone is because it is needed to put there because of side effects. They're covering their own ass. It's not about the fact that it's a female hormone. Do I really have to break down the fact that she's once again deriding trans men and claiming that trans masc experiences are more rewarding than trans female experiences, even in general culture? Because it's so full of bullshit. Briar and I were talking about the disposability of men in both conservative and liberal leftist cultures. And Briar made a very important statement that I'm going to share here. It is, masculinity is ornamental. The moment that you start genuinely taking an interest in, say, something like cars, you are side-eyed as one of those types of men. But you have to have a general interest in sports, cars, working out, muscles, being a dude bro, or you are not seen as a man. The moment you start caring deeply about a masculine interest, you are no longer a well-rounded man. The moment a woman or femme-leaning person takes an interest in a typically masculine hobby, it's good. They're fine. I don't know what else to say except that Julia Serrano is clearly a gender essentialist who wants to paint trans women as the most maligned sex of all the sexes. And she is scapegoating trans men to do it, as well as shoving non-binary people so far under the rug because she went from non-binary to binary, so clearly that's the way it is for everyone. So, let's end this on a positive note. Y'all want to see Ned? I want to show you Ned, because I groomed her today in this dank-ass apartment, and she's right here. Come here. Oh, say hi to the YouTube. You can see her face better now. And see, she's naked. She's a naked buddy now. She's got naked body. We shaved you down short. Can I show him my toe beans? I gotta clip her front paws, but she's got toe beans again. Yes, you do. 'Cause she's a good girl. She's looking at the fish tank like, what the fuck? Yeah. You are so good. I bet you would write a better book than Julie. Julia Serrano. There you go. Goodbye. I feel better after petting her. But I'm gonna let y'all go, process that. I almost don't want to keep reading the book, but I feel like I have to just to see if she redeems herself in any way. Stay healthy, stay hydrated. I'll talk to y'all tomorrow. Bye.